Welcome back to Blender Daily. In today's tutorial I want to demonstrate how you can create a futuristic tablet like the one you can see here with plane tracking and compositing in Blender. Let me show you. Alright, so here is the footage that we're going to work with today. If you want to follow along with me, you can download this and all the other files that I use in this tutorial with the link in the video description. For this I just filmed an acrylic plane that I held in my hands and I added 4 points in each corner that we're then going to use later on in Blender for the motion tracking. You could also record this on your own, or as I said, download the video that I used with the link in the description if you want to follow along. And I also created this short animation that we're going to use for the display. You can also download this or you can create it on your own. I used these templates from rocketstock.com. They have a few free assets that I could use to create this animation. So I also put the link to this asset pack in the video description, and if you want you can create your own animation or just use the same that I did. Okay, so let's start with motion tracking. So I'm going to open up a new blend file, and let's first adjust a few settings. So in the output settings, you want to change this to 4K since the original footage is also in 4K. So this is 3840 by 2160, and the frame rate should be 30 FPS since that's what I recorded this footage at, as you can see right here. Then let's open up a motion tracking workspace. So I click on the plus, VFX, and select motion tracking. We don't need those top 2 windows, so we can just close them and then drag and drop our footage in here. So now we have this ready. I'm gonna make it full screen, and let's first set the scene frames so that our timeline matches the clip that we imported. And let's also click prefetch so that the full clip is loaded into memory, and this will speed up the motion tracking process quite a bit. Okay, for the motion model, in this case I don't want to use location but instead location, rotation and scale, since that gave me the best results when I tested this effect out. And I also want to enable normalize, since we have a few reflections that go over our points, and normalize will help us get better results in those cases. We can leave the rest, and let's place our first tracking marker. So just hold down Ctrl and left click to add a new tracking marker, and then we can scale it up with S so that it covers the whole point. You could also move it around with G or rotate it with R. Now I also want to press Alt S to bring in this bigger square, which is the search radius, which is the how far it is gonna look for this point throughout the from frame to frame. So I like to have this a bit bigger, and once everything is set up you can press this button to start tracking forward. And you can also press L on your keyboard to lock the tracker to the view, so it will always stay centered. And this seems to work pretty well, so let's see. And yeah, this worked great. The tracker stayed on throughout the whole shot. So let's go back to the first frame, add another tracking marker, again hold down Ctrl and left click, scale this up a bit, and again you could use this button or make use of the shortcut Ctrl T to track forwards. Now at some point it lost the tracker, so just go back to the last frame where it worked and adjust the search radius, and usually it will continue to work. Now it lost it again. Just change the search radius a bit, Ctrl T again, and yeah, it has a few issues, but this doesn't matter as long as it works in the end, which it does, and it is now tracked throughout the whole clip. So let's go back to the first frame. To quickly go back to the first frame, you can use the shortcut Shift and the left arrow, or Shift and the right arrow to quickly get to the last frame. Those are two really useful shortcuts I use all the time. So now you should be on the first frame. Control left click to add a new tracker, scale it up a bit, make the search radius bigger, and Control T to track forwards. Now it also lost it. Maybe scale down the whole thing a bit. Just the search radius, Control T to continue. Okay, let's adjust the search radius again, Control T. And this worked as well, so there's only one left. Back to the first frame, Control left click, scale it up, increase the search radius, Control T. Also lost it, so again adjust the search radius, Control T. And now all our 4 trackers are done. I'm gonna press L on the keyboard to disable the locking. And when I scrub through the timeline, all those markers seem to track pretty well. Okay, so let's create our plane track. For this we need at least 4 trackers throughout the whole shot that are all placed on the plane, which we have right now. So you could also have more than 4, but there have to be at least 4 all the time throughout the shot to make it work. So press A to select all of them. Go to Solve, and we don't need any of this. Just go to Plane Track and choose Create Plane Track. This will bring in this square, and we can now just take those corners and match it with the corners of our acrylic glass plane. Bring this in here. And the last one. And now I can just play the timeline, and this square will stick to our glass plane, which is really awesome. So as you've seen, this is an extremely easy and useful technique, and usually works pretty well. So we can also rename our plane track. So just press N to open up the side panel, and under track, plane track, we should find our plane track. I'm just gonna rename this to, let's say, screen. And that's already it. Now we can switch to the compositing workspace to continue combining our screen with the original footage. So I'm gonna switch this workspace over here to an image editor and change this to the viewer node so we can see what we're doing in the compositor. Here I enabled use nodes, and I'm gonna disable the backdrop. And currently we have a render layer node in here, but we don't need this. We're gonna delete it since we're not gonna do any 3D rendering in this project. And since we're not doing any 3D rendering, I also wanna go to the render properties and under performance, where is it? Color management. I wanna switch the view transform from filmic to standard. Let me show you this in the motion tracking workspace. Again, go to the color management, and you can see the difference between filmic and standard. Filmic will give us slightly wrong colors. This filmic is better if we are doing 3D rendering. However, if we are just working with footage and we're only going to use the compositor, it is better to use standard to get correct colors. So I just leave this at standard. And now let's start with our composite. So first I press Shift A and bring in a movie clip. Load in our footage. And I also want to have a viewer node so we can take a look at it in the image editor. Now whenever I have a movie clip in the compositor, I also want to bring in a distort scale node and adjust this to the render size. Now currently you can't see any difference, But if I go to the output settings and bring down the resolution to 50%, which is going to be 1920 by 1080, it will also scale down our movie clip. Now I'm doing this because the compositor in Blender is pretty slow, and so I really like to bring this down to 50%, which will speed up the compositing quite a bit. And then for the final render in the end, I can bring this back up to 100% and render in 4K if I want to, or just leave it at 50% and render in full HD. But yeah, for now I prefer to use 1920 by 1080 since this is a lot faster. Okay, so let's bring in our second clip, which is going to be the display. So again, input, this time I'm going to select image, click on open, and select our image sequence, select all of them and open image. Again, you can find this image sequence with the downloads in the video description if you want to follow along with me. So let's take a look at this in the viewer node, and this looks really bad. There's an issue with those PNG files. In this case, I haven't found out what the issue is, but I have a solution for it. We can just bring in a set alpha node, bring this in here and connect the alpha output with the alpha input of the set alpha node. And now this image is working. Again, I don't know why this is happening, but this set alpha node should solve the issue. Now let's combine this with our original movie clip. For this we're gonna use first we need to distort our display so that it actually fits onto our plane in here. So for this we are gonna use a distort plane track deform node. In here select the footage, the camera and our screen plane track. And when we have this, you can see that it distorts our clip exactly the way it should be, how our plane moved. So we can combine this with the movie clip, and for this we are going to use a color alpha over node. Bring the movie clip into the top input and the plane track deform into the bottom input. Then let's take a look at this, and now the scales are off, which is because we use the scale node in here for the movie clip, but not for this plane track. So we would just want to duplicate the scale node, Shift D, bring it down here, and now this matches perfectly. So yeah, this is already pretty good. However, this is very soft and not really well visible, so I want to improve the colors a bit. So first of all, I want to adjust the movie clip with a color RGB curves node and make it a bit darker so that our display is a bit better visible. And then I also want to use a color hue saturation value node for the display. Just slightly bring up the saturation, say 1.5, which will make it a bit more blue. And even more important is to bring up the value, let's say 2. Or yeah, I think I'll make this even stronger. So currently you can see that the limit of the slider is 2, but if you click on it, you can type in even higher values. So let's say I'm gonna bring this to 4. Maybe this is too much, so bring this down to 3.5. Okay, this already looks better. This display pops a bit more. But if we want a bit more realism, we can go back to this plane track deform node and also enable motion blur, which will give it a slight amount of motion blur. It's hard to see, but it will add just a bit of realism to our plane track by giving it a bit of motion blur. Now it is better visible on this frame. So if I disable this, you can see that those lines are perfectly sharp. But if I enable it, we get just a bit of motion blur, which will make this whole result way more realistic. Now I also want to give it a slight bloom effect so that those colors are glowing a bit. And for this we want to use the glare node. So press Shift A, and I think this is under filter, the glare. Bring this in here, connect this with our display output, and let's take a look at it in the viewer node. And I don't want to use streaks. Instead I switch this to fog glow. And let's bring up the mix to 1 so we only see the actual bloom, which is not a lot currently. So maybe suggest bring down the threshold to 0.5 so we get a bit more bloom. Yeah, this is much better. So let's combine this with our previous composite. And for this we need to use Shift A, color, mix node. Bring the glare into the bottom input and change this from mix to, I think it should be add. And this gives it just a slight glowing effect, which I think improves the image a bit. So if I mute this node, you can see the difference without the glare, and with it right here we get just a bit more glow, which I think looks pretty good. Okay, so now our composite is already pretty good, but we still have those tracking markers in here that look really bad, and I don't want to have them in our final result. So let's create a mask to remove them. So I open up a new workspace, just gonna be a masking workspace. Close those two windows, they are not necessary at the moment, and load in our footage. Let's create a new mask and call this tracking markers. Tracking markers. Then go to add and bring in a circle, which will add a circle in the bottom left corner. We can then bring this over one of our trackers. Scale it up so that it covers the whole tracker. Let's also adjust this timeline, and then we can just shift click on the tracker with all the points selected and press Ctrl P to parent them. And now I can scrub through the timeline and this circle will always follow this point. And I think I want to scale this up just a bit more so that it completely covers our point. Then, yeah, let's bring in another circle. G to move it over the point. Place it right here, scale it up. Shift click on the tracking marker, Ctrl P to parent it. Add circle, another one. Scale it up with S, G. Shift click on the tracking marker, Ctrl P to parent. Again, add another circle, G. Place it on our last tracker. Shift click and Ctrl P to parent this, and let's quickly check. Scrub through the timeline and make sure that they always cover those tracking markers. I think I might want to scale this one up a bit more. Place it over here. And this should be fine. Okay, so let's go back into the compositor, but first I want to save the file. So I just save this to my folder, so I won't lose the progress in case Blender crashes. So let's go back to the compositing, and we want to use this before our RGB curves node. Press Shift A and under input bring in a mask node. Right here we can use our tracking markers mask, and if we take a look at it, we get this black and white mask that covers all our tracking points. Now this is a really harsh mask, so I want to blur it a bit with a filter blur node. Change this to fast Gaussian. I want to use relative, and let's Let's blur this with 1%, which should be pretty fine. Okay, so let's switch the viewer node back, and after the movie clip, we're now gonna bring in a color mix node and use the blur node for the factor or our tracking markers mask. So now you can see that those points are covered with those white points, and we don't want to use this white. Instead, we want to use the same footage. However, we're gonna blur it, the bottom input. Again, switch this to fast Gaussian, relative, and this time blur it a bit more. So let's say 5. And if you now take a look at it, you can see once the blur is applied, those tracking markers aren't visible anymore. If you zoom in really close, you can see that there is this blurred spot. However, it is hardly noticeable. And there, you could go to any frame, wait for it to update, and you can see that those tracking markers are almost invisible. So if I mute this node, you can see the difference. This is what it looked like before, and here is what it looks like when we have the tracking markers blurred. So yeah, that's almost it for this tutorial. However, I want to make a few last adjustments in the end. So first of all, I want to bring in a matte ellipse mask node, and just to give it a slight vignette. So let's take a look at this. I want to have a width of 1, let's say the height 0.5. Then Shift A, filter another blur node. Again, fast Gaussian, relative, and let's say 10% to really blur this out. And then mix it together with our previous composite. Now it is important that you put the ellipse mask into the bottom input and the footage into the top input. Maybe let's bring this down so we can see it a bit better. And I don't want to use mix. Instead, I'm gonna switch this to multiply and bring the factor. Yeah, I probably have to bring it down. Let's say 0.5 to just give it a slight vignette. And I also want to increase the contrast a bit, which is the last thing that I want to do. So Shift A, color, RGB curves, and give it a slight S curve, just to increase the contrast of the overall image. And yeah, I think this looks pretty good. So don't forget to also connect the composite node in the end, otherwise the render won't work. So yeah, let me quickly show you the final node setup. So you can take a screenshot or just compare it with your results. Okay, so now let's render this animation out. So we want to go to the rendering tab. Let's open this timeline. So we have 398 frames. But this should render pretty fast since we're not doing any 3D rendering. We're only rendering from the compositing, from the compositor, which is a lot faster. So we don't have to worry about the samples at all because it's not going to do any 3D rendering. But now I want to bring up the resolution back to 100%. So I render in 4K. You could still leave this at 50% if you think 1920 by 1080 is enough for you. And for the output format, I want to use FFmpeg video. And I'm also going to use this MP4 preset. And then let's also add an output folder. Now another quick tip, whenever you are in the file view or in the file browser in Blender, you can just go to this file path and enter /, click enter, and it will quickly bring you to the current directory, which is the folder where your blend file is saved. This is a really handy shortcut I use all the time. So let's give this a file name, maybe Futuristic tablet. Choose accept, and now we are ready to render. So to render, you can either go up to render and choose render animation, or just use the shortcut Ctrl F12 which should do exactly the same thing. And up here you can see that it takes me around 7 seconds per frame. So this full render should be, I think, around 45 minutes, which is totally okay for me. So I'm gonna end the recording for now and come back to you once the render is finished. Okay, so my render is finished and I'm really happy with the result. I hope you could follow along and everything worked out for you. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I will do my best to help you out. This episode is sponsored by Polygoniq, the creators of my favorite Blender add-ons. They offer huge tree and grass, car and material libraries to speed up your Blender workflow. All their assets are extremely high quality and the add-ons are packed with lots of useful extra features. I've been using their add-ons for more than a year now. Their plugins are regularly updated and new models and shaders are being added constantly. And the best thing about it is that currently you can get 33% off all their products with the coupon code DOGDAYS70. This code is valid until August 21st. I highly recommend you to check out their page. I'm sure you'll find something useful for you. The link is in the video description. I am Nick from Blender Daily. See you in the next one.